Welcome to The Watchdog. This is Lowkey. I appreciate you joining us for another week. As you know, we are going against the grain, covering stories which are routinely ignored by the mainstream media. For that reason, we hope that you can support us on Patreon if you can. We hope that you can support us by liking, subscribing, and sharing this video. This week, we are here to discuss the Red Hill water crisis in the islands of Hawaii. We are joined by two fantastic guests and fascinating organizers. Firstly, Ihilani Lasconia, an artist, a singer, an organizer from Waimānalo. She's a master's candidate at the University of Hawaii. And we look forward to her insights on what exactly is happening at the Red Hill facility. We're also joined by another native Hawaiian musician, street scholar, and organizer from Honolulu by the name of Daniel Kauwila Mahi. It's great to be joined by him. We know that he is currently studying his PhD. It's great to be joined by you both. Welcome and thanks for coming.
Thank you for having us.
The first question, I think it's important for those of us, Hawaii was one of those places that Captain Cook, the British sailor of the seven seas, who is more famous for originally sticking the British flag into the soil of what would later become Australia. Hawaii is one of those places that he also ventured to hundreds of years ago. What many people don't know is that the chain of islands which make up Hawaii are not just the seven which are inhabited by human beings. As far as I understand, there's a chain of about 132 different islands, reefs, and other manifestations of life, of natural life. If you could just break down for us, what exactly is this chain of islands that people know as Hawaii?
Yeah, so Hawaii is central to the Pacific, and it's about 5,000 miles away from any other large body of land. So other islands or even like a continent, aside from the ocean as a continent, as we like to refer to each other as like an oceanic people. There are 7 inhabited islands. Prior to the overthrow in 1893, there were 8 inhabited islands. One of them, so I'll go over the names. Hawaii Island, which is the most southern. Kaho'olawe, Molokai, Maui, Lanai, Oahu, Kauai, and Ni'ihau are the major inhabited or major islands as we refer to. There really is 132 other islands. We refer to the larger archipelago traditionally in chants as Hawaii Nui Akea, or prior to America's occupation of Hawaii, we also refer to the whole chain as Ko Hawaii Pai Aina, or the Hawaiian archipelago.
And what would you say is the extent of US military presence across these 132 islands?
I would say that aside from Oahu being one of the major points where there's occupation, where about, I think, 20% of the land is occupied by military, and the rest is like military housing. There are bases all throughout the major, four major islands. And then there's also a couple bases outside or referred to as naval property or naval bases, which are just places where they stock up on fuel to go and pretty much colonize the rest of the world.
Now, my understanding is at the time of US annexation of Hawaii, you had almost 40,000 native Hawaiians signing a petition against that annexation. And President Roosevelt actually at the time said, we ought to take Hawaii in the interests of the white race. So I guess the first question is, how did Hawaii come to be a US territory? But also, what were those interests of the white race that Roosevelt was referring to?
That's a really good question. Thank you so much for asking. And then going back to what Kauwila was saying and what you were saying, Captain Cook came in 1778, which is about 200 years prior. But I'd like to put in like a special fun fact that Hawaiians capped and cooked Captain Cook in 1779. So we eliminated his presence on behalf of all indigenous peoples. So solidarity with you folks. But going back to your question of how Hawaii became a part of the United States of America, it's important to note that even on an international level, and even according to US law, we are under the guise of an illegal occupation. And so people like to use the terms colonization, occupation. What's important to remember is that both legally, socially, and politically, we are a sovereign people, regardless if you're Kamakamali, Native Hawaiian, or non-Native, but a Hawaiian national. We are under the guise of an illegal occupation. And there are a couple of things that happened prior to the overthrow that I guess created this chain of events for us to be illegally overthrown. And what's important to keep in mind is that militarism and capitalism have always worked in tandem with the United States to occupy Hawaii, just like they've done with other like territories such as Guam, American Samoa. But there's something called the Reciprocity Treaty that was signed in 1875 by force by Kalakaua, who was one of the last reigning monarchs. And essentially what that did was huge oligarchs, so white folks who owned sugar plantations, wanted more control of sending sugar over to the United States without paying a tax. So because Hawaii was a sovereign nation, everything that they exported to the United States had a pretty immense tax on it. So looking at capital and capitalism, they wanted to lift this tariff. So there was this reciprocity treaty in 1875 that lifted that tax from exporting sugar from the Hawaiian Kingdom to Hawaii. Keep in mind, Hawaiians and the monarchy didn't control sugar. It was all white companies. But what's important to keep in mind with that is that within this reciprocity treaty, Pu'uloa, also known as Pearl Harbor, was given to the United States. And so although it wasn't until about 1919 that Pearl Harbor Naval Base was created, the beginning of militarism, it honestly stems to the 1800s in the history of the Kingdom of Hawaii. So even before we were illegally occupied, even before we were overthrown, the United States always wanted a hand in militarism in Hawaii, because Hawaii specifically, and Oahu specifically, was essentially the gateway to colonizing the rest of the Pacific and even having expansion into the East, working with colonial powers such as Japan. But sorry, I go on tangents, but going off of that, so there's the Reciprocity Treaty that allowed the United States to have access to Pu'uloa, also known as Pearl Harbor. And then jumping past that, there was the Bayonet Constitution that was signed on July 6, 1887 by King Kalakaua. What's important to note is that there was no, or there wasn't a lot of agency with signing this constitution. At the time, we had a constitutional monarchy. So those in his cabinet were part of that oligarch of white sugar planters. If you didn't have land, you couldn't vote or you couldn't be in this cabinet. So it's important to note that by this time, there was a predominantly white cabinet and white folks who were in power making these decisions. And it's not to say that Kamakamali didn't have agency, but the amount of control that they had over our government was quite a bit. And so that constitution was signed on July 6, 1887. And then just a few years later, January 17, 1893, a coup de main happened in the Hawaiian Kingdom. And what's important to note is people will say that it's a coup d'etat, but a coup d'etat is when it happens within a nation. But because folks were doing this on behalf of their own interests and therefore on behalf of America, because they were folks who were working towards American interests, it's a coup de main. Just a fun fact and like semantics wise. But up until then, January 17th, 1893, there was illegal occupation. that occurred legally and in the sense of militarism. And then you fast forward, we became a territory of Hawaii through that. And then we were annexed to the United States via Grover, Cleveland, and William McKinley. So while those presidencies were transitioning, we became a formal territory of the United States. And what's so important to note is that the United States didn't even abide by their own laws. So Hawaii was incorporated as a territory of the United States through something called joint resolution. And according to their own law, joint resolution only happens when it's two US territories that have existed already. So to put it in example, if Washington, the state, wanted to encapsulate Oregon through joint resolution, they could become one entity, or they could absorb one another. But because the Kingdom of Hawaii was sovereign, they're breaking their own law. But it was passed through a joint resolution, and then we became a territory of Hawaii. And then in 1959, on August 21st, by popular vote, Hawaii became an official state, the 50th state of the United States. All of this being said under the guise that we're still under legal occupation because there's nothing legally binding that ties us to the United States of America. And then in 1993, there was an apology resolution / bill where the United States recognized the wrongdoings, recognized that Hawaii was illegally overthrown. But besides that bill, no action has been taken to restore the sovereignty of Hawaii or give reparations to Kanakamoli, also known as Native Hawaiians. So no, that was a long spiel. That's kind of like a crash course into what was going on and what's still going on. But yeah, Kauwila, if you want to chime in or anything, yeah.
Mahalo, Ihi. That was very comprehensive. The only things that I'll add to what you said is that between the arrival of Captain Cook, who was also a naval agent, right, from the UK, and the annexation or the overthrow in 1893, there's a population collapse. So between 400,000 to 1 million Hawaiians existed or had life prior to the arrival of Captain Cook. And by the time of the overthrow, Hawaiians had largely gone down to about 20 to 40,000 people. And so the anti-annexation petitions or the ku'e petitions that were composed and written has about 21,000 signatures. And what's really amazing about it, well, the reason that most Hawaiians believed that the annexation petitions would be sufficient or weren't willing to, I guess, violently try to project or take control or take land back is that the Hawaiian government had been so efficient in terms of law prior to the dwindling down of Hawaiians in the cabinet. And so any time that a petition would be submitted, whether it's like one person or 100 or 1,000 or at this point 20,000, every single petition would be heard. And it's because of that intimacy they had with their government, where you would literally see like the king walking barefoot on the sidewalk and you could say hi to them. And it wouldn't be like an obscure thing for you to have a relationship with them, even as big or as minuscule as it is. And so that anti-annexation petition was so profound to Kanakamali, to Native Hawaiians, because of that, we believe that the law would be just and that like the treaties and laws and petitions would be at the very least heard in the American setting. But when so women organized from Hilo, they started the organization to get the anti-annexation petition signed. The youngest signature is 3 years old. The oldest is 102. And so within that range, people were running out of their valleys, literally, when they heard that the ku'e petitions were rolling around. And so there's even stories of people like crawling out from like the mountains, running down the mountains right by the stream, sometimes tripping over and sometimes getting injured because they wanted to sign the petition.
Wow.
And so that's how intimately and that's how much faith they had in the law and in petitions in general. And so I think that's a really critical juncture for us to contextualize even further how different life was for Hawaiians during the Hawaiian monarchy and how intimate they felt they were with the people who were in power or the people who were there to serve them and not and actually had their interests in mind.
I guess there's two questions that I wanted to ask here. The first one is this population decrease that you mentioned. It seems to be consistent with other societies which did not have contact with the rest of the world in a major way. So you had, for example, in Tasmania, or what would become Australia, the contact with Captain Cook and British colonizers led to exposure to, along with genocidal violence, it led to exposure to diseases which the populations didn't have immunity to, and so led to massive population decreases. What are the reasons for that drop in people, really, in Hawaii during that period that you mentioned? But also, in addition to that, you mentioned sugar plantations. I've also read a little bit about the gathering of workers from Hawaii that were sort of referred to as Kanakas for the purpose of guano mining in other US colonies. So this small group of people that was obviously decreased massively because of the contact with colonizers, what part did they play in, the US economy also? What did they add to it? When you also think of the fact that in 1945, if you count the occupations as part of a sort of greater United States, you had 51% of the population of the greater United States living outside of the quote unquote mainland. That was about 135 million people living outside of the greater United States and being of economic use, really, to the mainland. And of course, unfortunately, Hawaiians were a small part of that also. So I'd be interested really in extending that question of population decrease, but then also the economic use of that population, unfortunately.
Cool. Thank you so much for that question. And to answer the first part, what we're experiencing now is with COVID-19 is different in a lot of ways, but it's something that our people have seen before in regards to epidemics. So the population decrease that we've had in the late 1700s, going into the 1800s, and arguably even towards the early 1900s, was because Kamakamali didn't have immunity towards diseases and sicknesses that were common in the United States and in Europe. So things like leprosy, things like rosacea, things like even the common cold and fever, because we didn't have immunity to it, caused a lot of Hawaiians to be sick. So much so that culturally speaking, we have things called like baby's first luau's, or like technically baby's first birthday parties. And it's such a huge celebration even today when a baby who's Hawaiian turns 1, because more often than not, when a keiki or a child was born during that time, they wouldn't make it. So there's an absolute correlation between these epidemics that were happening through the course of about 150 to 200 years and the population decrease. And what's important to note is with this population decrease, it was also coupled with an influx of folks coming from the West into the Hawaiian Kingdom. So it was a 2-part situation that ultimately caused Kamakamali just to become more sick and more sick. But also talking about that a little bit, there was, in relation to sugar planters, there was also an influx of folks from other colonized places across the world who came to Hawaii to work on plantations. And so it's important to remember, it's important to realize that imperialism and colonization, whether it be here, whether it be in Puerto Rico, whether it be in Guam, it never happens in a silo. That these places that the U.S. is occupying is always working in tandem and are always in conversation with each other. So folks that were being colonized by the U.S., such as the Philippines, such as Puerto Rico, we had folks who were escaping U.S. colonization coming here to the Hawaiian Islands to work on plantations through coerced and forced labor, because the U.S. was already desecrating their homelands. So to kind of lay it out and briefly restate for everyone, there was a population decrease of Kanaka Maoli because of a large spread of epidemics from a range of sicknesses that Kanaka Maoli didn't have immunity to. that coupled with a lot of folks from the West, predominantly America and Europe, coming to Hawaii, and then folks of color, indigenous folks from Puerto Rico, from the Philippines, from other places such as China and Japan, who are experiencing US colonization, coming to Hawaii to work on plantations. And then with that, I'll pass it off to Kauwila to answer the second half of your question.
Yeah, mahalo Ihilani. So just as she stated, capital really drove the fevers and sickness and epidemics that were going on throughout the duration of the Hawaiian Kingdom. The earliest, I would say, contributions of Kanaka Maoli Hawaiians to actually the American capital is in 1820s, which is roughly like right after the Ainua, or the overthrow of the abolishment of the kapu system in Hawaii. So it's like we're transitioning into having contact with other nations, specifically the US and the UK. And so the earliest forms of capital is, Opukaha'ia is sent off to Boston, or Bosetona, as we called it at the time. And he's a prince of one of the royal ali'i, and he becomes and learns to become a missionary. And while he's in Boston with others, one of the things that happens is white women specifically are trying to write letters to him because they're exoticizing him. And because he's become proficient in at least 5 languages by the time like people are finding out about him during his studies as a missionary. And so that's like one of the earliest forms of capital from Hawaii. The next one, well, at least for America. And then after that, we start to get more Hawaiians taking on missions. We start to get Hawaiians that are becoming whalers, Hawaiians that are becoming laborers on plantations forcefully in the United States. Some Hawaiians become slaves. Some join the American Revolution. And actually, you can see those names all throughout the South. You'll see like Hawaiian street names in, especially in Georgia and Louisiana and those places, because there's a lot of history in at least Hawaiian language newspapers that Hawaiians are starting rebellions against slavery in those places. And then right up, some of our other exports, one of the biggest ones outside of sugar is pulu, or Hawaiian cotton. And that's what they use to stuff the California beds, the king size California beds from the 1850s up until the 1890s. And right around the 1890s, they stopped using pulu. Right at the same time, actually, as the overthrow is when they cut off that stream of income. Some of the other exports we had, aside from scholars, is one of the other main ones is alcohol. So we exported a lot of beer. One of the most famous is Primo beer. And then we exported a lot of rum. And Okolehao, Hawaiian moonshine was one of our other exports. So we had actually an economy where we were producing our own capital, but Americans were taking on, right? We're contributing to the livelihood of America, essentially, because of sugar, because of pulu, that Hawaiian cotton, and because of the liquor exports that we had. And that's just the 19th century. But when in terms of the 20th century, like 1900s, there's more of a focus on tourism. And this is like that hinging point. After the overthrow in 1893, one of the first things that Dole, one of the people who helped orchestrate the overthrow, does is he tries to eliminate all water and lo'i, or taro patches in Waikiki. And Waikiki is that image flung around the world that's on postcards that everybody kind of knows of as Hawaii, or identifies as Hawaii. And so he eliminates all of the food production. He eliminates the water springs to build roads, and it's so efficient. Like, he's pretty good at colonization, I would say. But then because of this, he turns it into a tourist park, or some people call it an abusement park. And at this point, when it's hinged together, tourism and the military, they start to play into each other, because all these places where tourism has been seeping into in Hawaii, especially in Waikiki, there's also places where they're building military bases. So in Diamond Head, in Leahi, or that image that most people see on postcards, there's a base inside. Other lands that they acquired are throughout Waikiki. And so it's one of the pivotal places outside of Pu'ula or Pearl Harbor in Hawaii where it's a flashpoint where they go off and find other or port and make moves to overthrow or start to wage war on other nations. But there's hope with that too. I think it's really important that we know some of the stories where Hawaiians won against the military. But I don't know, should we wait on that a little bit or?
Well, what I would say is if we can just go a little bit more into that question of how, the Hawaiian Islands as the site of what are known as Superfund sites, which is basically where the US military has contaminated spaces beyond repair. We know there's an unknown amount of nuclear weapons stored in the Hawaiian Islands. There's also the storage of chemical weapons, and even sites that have been used for bomb testing. How does that then measure up against this question of Hawaii as a tourist paradise when we look at those, when we compare and contrast those two things? But then after that, it would be great to look at the examples of successful resistance to this militarism, no doubt.
Absolutely. So if you think it would be helpful, what I can do is I can go over some sites across Hawaii, but predominantly on Oahu, their size and some of the catastrophes that have happened. Okay, I'm going to try to go through this as efficiently as possible. But starting with our topic of discussion for today, Kupukaki, also known as Red Hill, and works in conjunction with Pu'ula or Pearl Harbor or Camp Smith. That's 220 acres large. The tanks that have been leaking for years now, but one of the biggest leaks happening in early December was built in 1943. There's 20 tanks in total. They're 100 feet wide. But what's so atrocious about this, it sits just feet above our largest aquifer. And so for folks who aren't too familiar, an aquifer, specifically for islands and other places as well, holds all of our fresh water. So it's our filtration system. It's what creates drinking water. So Hawaii doesn't import water for us to shower, to bathe, to wash our cars. So that has been poisoned. There are families have been speaking out who've lived on military bases near Pearl Harbor who have been sick. Women, children, men included, have been poisoned. Animals have been poisoned. And what they're doing now is they were flushing it out by dumping all of that contaminated water into the streets. But our drainage system, it leads right into the ocean. So that was just one catastrophe. There's another Air Force base in Waimānalo, which is where I'm from, near Hunananiho. So it's an Air Force base. It's 1,495 acres. It was built in 1917, but was solidified as a permanent base in 1941. And something that we have to keep in mind, and Kumu Hananike Trask, who's an amazing Hawaiian scholar, activist, artist, says and she reminds that every time the United States goes to war, Hawaiians lose their land. So if you're looking at the dates that I'm speaking out on, a lot of it has to do with World War I and World War II, where every time the US wants to intervene, wants to colonize another place, another piece of Hawaii gets taken. And so at Bellows Air Force Base, Waimānalo, there's live fire training. So at my grandparents' house where I grew up, when you're going to sleep, you can literally hear the live fire rounds going off, and it's contaminating the water. The transmitter facility that they have is disrupting ocean life throughout this place. There's iwi kupuna, or ancestral bones who are buried at Bellows Air Force Base that were disrupted. And what's important to note is that in every single military base throughout Hawaii, there have been iwi kupuna, or ancestral bones, dug up to make these facilities. And right next to Bellows Waimānalo, there's Mokapu, which is kind of by Kaneohe. It's 332 acres. It was built in 1919. It's one of the first military bases built in Hawaii. It's the largest burial of iwi that has been destroyed, the longest in the history of militarism in Hawaii. And so there's 3,000 sets of human remains that were dug up and placed in the Bishop Museum. But in the words of Taikavika Tengan, Native Hawaiian anthropologist and scholar, every single time they do a project on a military base, they find iwi kupuna. So 3,000 sets was a number that they came up with. in 2009. So I can't even begin to imagine how much else they found. And then on the other side of the island, on the west side, there's Mokua. It's 4,856 acres. It's a live firing range as well. It was built in 1943. Because of World War II, there's a lot of unexploded ordnance over there. They evicted Hawaiians from living in that valley and in the beach that's below that valley. There's people who do demilitarization tours over there, but when they walk, they have to be extremely careful because there's still a bunch of unexploded ordnance. As you know, it's not just the bullets and it's not just the bombs, it's what happens after. So disrupting all of the limestone and all of like the Pohakua rocks that exist in the area, the wildlife. And then on another island, Hawaii Island, which is one of the largest bases, there's Pohakuloa, which is another live fire range. It's 207 square miles. It was built in 1955. What's important to know about this site is that it's literally miles next to Mauna Kea, which is one of the most sacred sites in Hawaii. It's the piko or the umbilical cord of our existence. If you haven't looked or heard about it already, Google Protect Mauna Kea with a 30-meter telescope, because all of these issues are in conjunction with each other. There's unexploded ordnance. The military itself has even said that there's depleted uranium across this site, or across 207 miles, that's poisoning people. There are folks who have had cancer and other diseases who live close to Pohakuloa, and that this is just the tip of the iceberg with the issues that we have with this place. There's also a lot of radioactive like poisons that are happening in Pohakuloa.
Just the question. So the US military has acknowledged that there's depleted uranium across the 270 miles that you just mentioned. It's yes. Publicly acknowledged this.
Oh yes. Everything that I'm saying is public knowledge. Even they'll have that that statistic on the Pohakuloa training site that there's depleted uranium, but they also have not necessarily a clause because it's just like a post, but they say that there's nothing to worry about. There's nothing that relates to the health defects that people have. So they're saying it. They're not hiding this. And what's important to note is that Hawaiians have always opposed militarization throughout Hawaii, and the United States has always been very vocal about them holding on to Hawaii because of militarism. And so this isn't even the worst of it. Imagine this is only what we do know. And imagine what we don't. And especially with the crisis at Kukaki or Red Hill, we're finding out more and more every single day about how this crisis has been unfolding for decades now. And so what's important to note is that the lease for Pohakuloa is coming up in a couple of years, and Hawaiians are fighting to get this place back. It's going to be an uphill battle, but we're ready. And then tying it back to Pohakuloa is Pu'uloa or Pearl Harbor. So going a full circle from Kukaki all around through Oahu, through Hawaii, to Pu'uloa. So it's 20.48 square miles. It was created in 1908, but like I said, the Reciprocity Treaty gave Pu'uloa to the United States in the 1800s. In 1875. In 1960, there was a nuclear-powered submarine in Pu'uloa that killed one crew member because it essentially exploded. And on December 7th, 1941, that's when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. And there's this ship called the USS Arizona that's still leaking oil to this day. And the only reason why the United States military doesn't want to stop the oil leaking is because they want to commemorate it as a historical event that'll live on forever. So them continuing to poison our waters is something that they pay homage to. It's something that they do to be patriotic towards the occupation of Hawaii. And it's ridiculous. So with that overview, something that I also wanted to educate the viewers about is that every single site that I've mentioned, besides Pohakuloa, is a tourist attraction. And the US military also has they don't just have on their bases like live fire training range. They also have hotels for the military members. They also have golf courses. They have putting ranges. They have go-karts. So for example, in Mokapu, it's one of the largest golf courses on the island of Oahu, and it's exclusively for military members. Bellows has cabins and places that military folks can stay at. So this coupling of tourism and militarism has always been in conjunction, has always been in conversation with each other, so much so that for the military in the United States, where it's not only their target practice, but it's also their paradise. So they continue to poison our sites, to poison our waters, poison our lands, and then continue just to make a vacation out of it at the same time. And so that was my brief overview. Kauwila, if you want to jump in, if you have any questions, please let me know.
Fantastic. Yeah, if you have something to add, please do.
I think did you want to talk about Kaho'olawe too, Ihi? Did you cover that one?
I didn't, but please feel free to jump in. Kauwila is extremely knowledgeable about the subject. But yeah, I think one of the last things that I'll say before Kauwila jumps in talking about Kaho'olawe, which was an entire island that was used as a target practice, was just really hammering down the fact that militarism and terrorism have always been connected with each other. And that's something we need to keep in mind. You can't divorce one from the other. And especially with the crisis going on in Red Hill, it's disastrous. And so, yeah, that's the only thing that I wanted to, I guess, repeat. But back to you, Kauwila.
Yeah. So I think I'll start actually a little bit back into right at the time of the overthrow. There's a couple rebellions that happened, which were trying to prevent the further desecration and further colonization of Hawaii by the American Navy in specific. And so one of the most famous rebellions happens in 1893, the same year. It's called the Kauwila, or another name is the Wilcox Rebellion. And so there's tons and tons of songs that are written about it. One of my favorite is called Alo Alo Ehu Ehu Po Ka. And this person, S.K. Kaloa, who's in prison as he's a political prisoner because he went against the U.S. Navy. And in this Wilcox Rebellion, there's kids as young as 9, elders as old as 90 who are arming themselves to resist against the U.S. Navy. And so the U.S. Navy is firing shots at them, trying to kill, 9-year-old kids for defending and wanting to have a continued and lasting intimate relationship with the land and with the Hawaiian monarchy. And so the Wilcox Rebellion, and in this song, Alo Alo Ehu Ehu Po Ka, or dancing or the animated dodging of the bullets would be like an interpretation of it. But all throughout the song, they account for the battles that occur by mentioning that the Hawaiians went into this place, and then while they're defending the land literally does things to defend them. And so the mist will come out in Manoa, kukui nuts, or like light candle nuts will start to fall and make the U.S. Navy slip. Rains will start to come, different types of mist in different valleys, and all throughout their battles and contestation, they always mention that they're dancing with the lightning, or obviously like the metaphor there being dodging the bullets, and like even to the point where they can smell it. And so that's one way that we try to account for the resistance against the U.S. Navy. But although some people had died in that rebellion, Hawaiians, especially the ones composing songs about this, were portraying it as a victory because they knew forever that they had resisted against American imperialism, and that their ancestors or their descendants would remember them and these acts through those songs. And so there's other resistances too. Kalua I Ko'olau is an amazing one. He's a leper who was trying to run away from the provisional government. And instead of running away towards others, he runs to his family to protect them. And he's winning battles against the U.S. Navy because he has like high ground, and he kills 3 of them. But people start to write like fantastic stories about him, and they call him like as similar to a god, where he's the reason that some places are named these names. He's the one that can summon lightning. He's the one that can like start a chant and make a roar, and then everybody else will fall. And so these are still in the late 19th century. One of my favorite people, Ka'uhane Vela Kahau, who's just like a random waterfront character in Honolulu, where I'm from. He goes to Chinatown, or what is now known as Chinatown in Honolulu. He buys a fake U.S. military naval attire. He wears it to the docks. He memorizes all the whistles and calls that the American Navy and American merchants would make. and he starts to create chaos in the water. And on one occasion, he makes a U.S. naval ship and a merchant ship crash into each other, and they both drown. And so that's one of my favorite like stories, because all he did was, it's quite simple, that he memorized calls, and he was able to disrupt capitalism and imperialism in like one move out on the water from just standing on the concrete by memorizing their calls. One of the biggest wins I think that Hawaii has had is also a loss at the same time. In Kaho'olawe during the 1970s, after the desecration and the bombing and the destruction of the water table, two people in particular, George Helm and Kimo Mitchell, who were fierce advocates of decolonizing and getting rid of the U.S. Navy and their continued bombing of Kaho'olawe. One of the things that they do, aside from having like a history of resistance, is they go out to do another occupation. They had done a few occupations with mostly people from Molokai and Maui, so like people who are from the countryside of the islands. And as they're going, they become lost at sea, or quote unquote lost at sea. And so I think we know that, well, we can't say for certain, but most people are sure that the US had essentially eliminated them because they had been creating such problems for that continued desecration of the land. But the way that Kanaka Maoli won in this instance is that when it was taken to court, the Navy actually lost against itself in the Supreme Court. And so they had to cease fire and cease the further desecration of Kaho'olawe. And one of the other, I guess, wins from that is they had to start to take away the UXOs, or unexploded ordinances. And they also had to give back, as part of their restoration plan, they had to give space for Hawaiian ceremony to take place on the island. And so Kaho'olawe has been one of the places where Hawaiian ceremony has become renormalized and restorative, not just for nation building, but for building cultural values back into the populace.
Beautiful. It would also be great to get some of those songs, if you have recordings of them, or if they're on YouTube, and we can kind of put them into the podcast as well. That would be quite cool. I guess then the question is, today, when looking at what is known in English language media, though the coverage has been minimal, what is the Red Hill crisis, and what has been the response of the state to this crisis exactly?
I think one of the most notable responses to the crisis is that the Secretary of the Navy said that we need petroleum and we need water. And so conflating that we need the two to survive was just ridiculous. And then with the state responding to the situation, they said that it was an issue of national security, not the safety of the water, not the safety of the people, but making sure that the Red Hill fuel tanks are up and running. And so the state's response to the situation has been absolutely horrendous. The state has worked with the military to try and cover it up. Only now, officials in Hawaii, whether it be in the House or the Senate, are speaking out about this. And it's important to note that what the US military did to the Hawaiian Kingdom is a war crime. To poison our waters, to poison our people is a war crime. To cover it up is a war crime. And that's something that needs to be made known. It's not the US messing up and poisoning its own land, which arguably is all illegally occupied, because it belongs to our brothers and sisters who are First Nations or are from Turtle Island, but has been absolutely ridiculous. In another meeting that I had, and for confidentiality, we won't say names, there have been people who have been impacted by this Red Hill water crisis, who have been poisoned by the water, and then real estate developers and folks from the military have shown up to their doors and told them not to speak out about this. And so that's ridiculous. And that's something that needs to be known, that the US military, one, isn't even working in the interest of their own people. So folks who live at Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam, the military doesn't even protect its own people. And it's not even in its own interest right now, because if you want to even sustain yourself as a colonizing power, why would you want to poison your largest asset in the Pacific? So they're essentially shooting themselves in their own foot by not allowing this to shut down. I know it's been in conversation, so the possibility of shutting down the Red Hill fuel tanks permanently is something that's still being discussed. But what's important to keep in mind, and I know I say this phrase a lot, is that it's a lot worse than what we think it is, because they're only letting us have a certain amount of information, and the information that we have and that we're reading isn't always told by the U.S. military. It's by watchdogs who have been tracking this issue for years, essentially. And what's important to keep in mind is that this isn't the first time that the fuel tanks at Red Hill have leaked. They've been leaking for decades now. This is just the largest spill. And I'd say arguably, and this is just my opinion, because it affected predominantly white people on the US base, that they're doing something about it. So not only that white folks are being affected, not only that folks who are associated with the military are being affected, that something is being done. And these tanks are old. Like I said, they were built in 1943. And what's important to keep in mind is that they're not some large industrial feats. The tanks are the thickness of this iPhone. It's like roughly the thickness of a rubber slipper. It's decrepit. When you think about the material that's made from our aquifer, limestone, you could build the quote unquote best tanks in the world. Nothing is going to get in the way of Vai and Pohaku, because it's going to eat away at whatever you decide to put into the ground. And it's, in one way, shape, or form, it's me saying that the AINA is rejecting militarization and militarism in Hawaii, because we can't have that in our kino or in our body. But it's been ridiculous. But the state has done a terrible response at this. And I'll leave it with this, and I'll pass it off to Kauwila. It's an act of terrorism. And the fact that US officials who work for the quote unquote state of Hawaii are afraid to speak out against the military because what the military will do to their careers and to the state of Hawaii, it's not a government, it's not a democracy. It's essentially a mafia run by terrorists who don't just hurt Hawaii, but indigenous peoples all across the world. Yeah.
Kauwila, would you like to add to that?
I don't know if I can. But something very brief, I think that we should also bring up is that this is a critical juncture for Hawaii. This is one of the first times ever that the military, tourism, and the real estate are actually in opposition of each other, whereas they had been working in conjunction with each other for over 128 years to continue to violently desecrate, terroristically threaten anybody who had come up to resist against them. And so what's critical about this issue and bringing it into the discussion is that this is the first time that they've been oppositional. So this is a really important time for us, not just Hawaiians or local people, but for everybody in Hawaii and maybe even the world, to think critically about how important it is to look at these pockets and spaces where we can find a wedge and hammer that wedge in, so we can really make moves and make tangible steps to get our land back, to have those relationships where we no longer have to be adverse with the military, adverse with the real estate, adverse with tourism, because all of these things are corporations being tied into each other, and they're going to continue to try and desecrate land and desecrate bodies, desecrate the water to the point where there's almost no return. But the thing about Oiwi or indigenous peoples in general is we still want those relationships with that land, and it doesn't matter how much desecration has occurred. We still want to have that pilina. That's still our mother. That's still our ancestor. So we don't want to break that mokapiko or break that, destroy that lineage and that relationship. And so this is a really, really critical time, not just for Hawaii, but for us to look at solidarity also with other nations and what those nations are doing in their aina and their lands to trouble and disrupt the empire and colonization and imperialism. Because all of us have these konare moves, or these steps that we can make now, and we can look to each other to find ways to disrupt their system, not just temporarily, but maybe for good.
And an emergency order was issued to defuel the Red Hill fuel tanks. However, the Secretary of the US Navy, Carlos del Toro, said this was a request rather than an order. And obviously, the US Navy has not done this yet, despite 93,000 people displaced from their homes, people sick and ill in hospital, and as you made clear, US military personnel clearly unwell and in a state of confusion. Carlos del Toro himself, before he became Secretary of the US Navy, founded an arms company called SBG Technology Solutions. And despite working for them as president and CEO for 17 years, he went on in this job into the US Navy, and still to this day has investments in the company worth between $25 million and $50 million. If you could speak directly to Carlos del Toro, what would you say to him?
I wouldn't even speak. I would throw punches. This is war. That's all I have to say about that. And I think I always say what's important to keep in mind. There's a lot of things you got to think about, but it's never, the U.S. military and U.S. militarism can never be severed from the arms trade. The U.S. starts wars across the world to empower themselves, and it's not about people or protection. It's one, primarily about oil, and two, about the arms deal, because we're the ones making weapons, selling it to other people. We're selling it to ourselves. So the fact that this bombshell came out saying that he's essentially profiting off of this huge arms deal and off of making these weapons, it's, like I said, it's not surprising, but it certainly hammers down the fact that it's always about either corporate interests or private interests that drive militarism and drive war. And I think one of the hugest arguments that people always say about Hawaii is, well, if the United States isn't here to protect you through their Marines, through their Air Force, the military, then who is? And I want to just eliminate like that fallacy by saying the U.S. is the largest threat to the Hawaiian Kingdom. It's been in the past, it's been now, and it will be in the future until they leave. They have to leave. When we think about the US's enemies, the USSR or Russia, China, even Japan, arguably, we've had treaties and good relationships with every other country that the US has literally obliterated and destroyed, or have sometimes in relation to Japan, have worked in tandem to colonize other parts of the Pacific. But we can get into that on a later date and time. But if I could say anything to him, no words, just punches. This is warfare. This is a war crime. This is an act of terrorism. The United States military and the United States as a country is the largest terrorist group in the entire world. And I think we have to acknowledge that and realize that they're the biggest threat to not just Hawaiian sovereignty, but to the continued existence of the human race. So no matter if you're American or Native Hawaiian or not, the United States is a threat to you because they poison their own people. They continue to poison us, and it's when we need to wake up and realize that we need to be in solidarity with each other. But yeah, I know that was a bit of a tandem, bit of a rant. But yeah, thank you.
Only thing I would say is we beat you once, we're gonna do it again.
Thank you so much to you both for taking this time today to speak to us. I hope that you will remain in contact with Mint Press, and Mint Press can work closely with you on publishing what is happening in your precious homelands. And I hope also that I can remain in contact with you both, and we can push out as much information about your struggle as possible. Nothing but love, solidarity, and respect to you both. Thank you for joining us today on The Watchdog.
Mahalo.
Mahalo.